Henry Cole liked to say that his whole adult life could be measured in porches. There was the first rented porch on a dusty street near the factory, where everything smelled like hot metal and fried food. There was the sagging wooden porch on the house he never quite finished paying off in his 30s. And there was this one: 3 concrete steps, 1 narrow slab, a white railing his son had installed when Henry's balance started to falter, and just enough room for a folding chair, a small table, and a man who had decided that he would grow old, facing the street he had earned. The house sat near the entrance to Willow Grove, the subdivision that only got its elegant name much later. When Henry and his wife, Lorna, first signed papers, no one called it anything grand. It was simply a quiet street near the plant, with small houses and ordinary neighbors. The developer's sales brochure had promised affordable comfort and room for families. Henry had been more focused on the numbers in the mortgage column and on the fact that for the first time in his life, his name would sit on a deed. He worked nights back then, coming home when the sky was gray and the birds were just starting to argue in the hedges. The porch became a transition zone, a place to let the factory noise leak out of his bones before stepping into the quieter chaos of a home with small children. Lorna would sometimes leave a cup of coffee on the step, still warm when he arrived. The children learned early that if they looked out of the front window at the right time, they would see their father appear under the streetlight and pause there, shoulders dropping with a weight that had nothing to do with tools. Years layered themselves over the concrete. The plant evolved, contracts changed, and the town's economic tide rose and fell. The tree Henry planted for Lorna after she died grew stubborn and crooked in the front yard. His son moved out, married, and later moved back in temporarily during a rough patch, carrying a granddaughter in his arms who would one day help her grandfather set up a pill organizer on the kitchen table. Through all of it, the porch remained. In the years after retirement, it became less of a transition and more of a sanctuary. Henry's right leg had a steel rod in it now, a souvenir from a factory accident that had almost cost him more than mobility. His heart had its own collection of scars and warnings. The doctor wanted him to walk, but not too far. Sit, but not all day. Breathe fresh air, avoid stress. The porch offered a simple compromise, a place to sit where the outside world could still reach him without demanding that he chase it. Then the neighborhood rebranded itself. New families arrived, bringing cars with temporary tags and moving trucks with company logos. Real estate agents started using words like established community and great curb appeal. Someone decided that the entrance needed a stone sign with the name Willow Grove Estates spelled in curling script that pretended the street had always been that way. Along with the sign came newsletters, meetings at the clubhouse, and the homeowners association. Henry did not remember anyone asking him whether he wanted an HOA. He remembered opening an envelope with a logo at the top and a list of dues in the middle. There were bylaws attached, written in tight paragraphs and numbered sections. The rules covered everything from trash cans to fence heights. One line referred to loitering in visible and common areas, phrased as if the front yards and porches had always been controlled spaces instead of places where people had once stood for hours, talking about nothing in particular until the mosquitoes drove them inside. He paid the dues. He did not attend the meetings. He assumed that whatever was happening behind those tidy agendas did not concern a man whose primary daily ambition was to keep his blood pressure stable and his grocery list short. He was wrong. Inside the HOA board, there were people who took their new authority very seriously. They discussed landscaping and security cameras and the color palette of acceptable front doors. They created a group chat to pass information quickly. At first, it was about bake sales and lost dogs. Then someone sent a photo into the chat, a blurry picture taken from a distance of an older black man sitting on a porch near the subdivision entrance, cane propped beside him, body relaxed in a way that suggested he had earned each minute of rest. The sender added a comment about how this did not look welcoming to potential buyers. Others chimed in. Some framed it in terms of image and first impressions. A few simply complained that he was always there. In their private, text-sized world, Henry stopped being Mr. Cole, the neighbor who had lived there since the houses were new, and became a visual problem at the gate. The first 911 call grew out of those messages almost naturally. It was a warm evening. Henry sat in his folding chair, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. His knee throbbed, but the air was cool, and the rhythm of passing cars and children's voices soothed something in him that medication could not reach. Somewhere past the bend in the road, a small group of board members traded comments in their chat. One of them said that the situation at the entrance had gotten out of hand. Another replied that they could not just let someone sit there all day. Finally, someone decided that, since there was a line in the bylaws about loitering and a section in the handbook about maintaining a safe environment, a call to the non-emergency number would be reasonable. By the time the call reached the dispatcher's screen, the language had shifted. The caller described a man sitting on a porch near the entrance who had been there all day and who made them uncomfortable. There was no mention of property ownership, no mention of medical devices or retirement. The system recorded the concern as a report of a suspicious person. 2 patrol cars rolled through Willow Grove with lights off but presence obvious. The officers were used to complaints from quiet neighborhoods. They knew the pattern: vague unease, short investigation, inevitable realization that nothing illegal was happening. They found Henry where the caller said he would be and confirmed, after a slow search through the database, that the address on his identification matched the number beside his door. The report they filed later was brief. A resident had been checked. No action had been necessary. For the HOA board, the encounter served a different purpose. In the group chat, someone posted that they had gotten the police involved and that it was on record now. The phrase "on record" became important. A single neutral police entry had been transformed into the first line in a story they wanted to tell, a narrative in which Henry was not an elderly homeowner, but an ongoing issue. Henry did not know about any of this. He only knew that for the first time since he had moved to Willow Grove, uniformed officers had walked up his steps and treated him like a stranger in his own doorway. Before left, he sat down again, more out of exhaustion than defiance, and stayed there until the sky darkened enough that the streetlights hummed on. The second, third, and fourth calls followed variations on the same script. Different board members and neighbors dialed, but their descriptions were remarkably similar. There was an older man sitting at the front. He was there for long periods. People felt uneasy. Children walked past. The callers rarely stated an outright accusation because there was nothing specific to accuse him of. They framed their fear as caution instead. The police kept coming. Each time, officers approached Henry. Each time, they asked for identification. Each time, they left with their suspicion quietly dismantled by his address and date of birth. Their body cameras captured a man who had trouble standing up quickly, who answered questions with patience that bordered on resignation, who had enough practice with authority to know that anger would only make everything worse. On paper, the reports remained uneventful. In the HOA chat, the repetition was treated as momentum. Members noted that there had now been multiple incidents. They speculated about whether this could eventually justify a formal action under the loitering clause in the bylaws. They traded screenshots of the police logs that one of them had obtained through a friendly contact. The gap between reality and the story they were building widened with each message. Meanwhile, Henry's body continued its own quiet negotiations. The metal in his leg ached in cold weather. His heart occasionally misfired, sending waves of fatigue through him that felt heavier than any shift at the factory ever had. His doctor adjusted medications, added new pills with names that were hard to remember and effects that were hard to ignore. The instructions remained consistent: limited exertion, regular rest, fresh air when possible. The porch routine became structured. In the morning, he took a short walk down the block and back. In the afternoon, he did small tasks in the house, moving slowly between kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom. In the evening, when the heat had faded, he went outside with his folding chair, pill organizer, and a bottle of water. There, he let the world come to him. Some neighbors greeted him. A few children waved as they passed on scooters. Several of the newer residents avoided eye contact, their faces arranged in neutral expressions that carried a different kind of message. Henry saw it all and filed it away in the quiet ledger he kept in his mind, a record of who considered him part of the landscape and who saw him as something out of place. The night his heart finally insisted on more attention than the porch could provide, he was doing nothing more unusual than listening to crickets. The pain started as a tightness behind his sternum and radiated outward in dull waves. It was not the dramatic clutch to the chest moment that television favored. It was a slow compression that made breathing feel like work. He pressed the button on the medical device clipped to his belt. By the time the ambulance arrived, the world had tilted just enough that the paramedics looked like they were standing at a slight angle. They treated the call as they would any emergency, directly and without asking whether Henry, sitting on his own steps, belonged there. They saw an elderly man with risk factors and symptoms. They applied oxygen, checked vitals, loaded him carefully into the vehicle, and drove away with the siren cutting through the same quiet that patrol cars had moved through before. In the hospital, machines and tests replaced the familiar view of his street. Henry drifted in and out of sleep while nurses adjusted drips and doctors discussed ejection fractions and medication interactions. His granddaughter, Alicia, sat by his bed, translating the medical language into something he could carry. She had grown up in that house, running from porch to kitchen and back. Now she moved between his room and the nurse's station with the confidence of someone who worked in healthcare and who understood both the system's limits and its tools. When Henry slept, Alicia scrolled through her phone. It was a habit as much as a distraction. She checked in on friends, on school assignments, on local news. One night, idly, poking at the screen while monitors beeped in a slow, irregular rhythm, she stumbled on a post in a local online group tied to Willow Grove. The photo in the post was blurry, taken from a car window or a long zoom. It showed an older man on a porch near the subdivision entrance. The angle was unmistakable. The cane leaning against the railing and the shape of the folding chair made it clearer. The comments under the image speculated about who he was. Some guessed he was just always there. Others suggested he made the neighborhood look less safe. A few claimed they had seen him around and did not like it. Alicia's jaw tightened. She scrolled further through the group. She found mentions of the HOA board chat. Someone had posted cropped screenshots of a conversation in which board members discussed the man at the entrance as a problem of curb appeal. There were suggestions that repeated calls to the police might create a record that could be used to enforce loitering rules. One person had even joked that if they kept it up, the man would get the message. It took time and effort, but Alicia gathered as much as she could. She saved images, downloaded videos, and took her own screenshots. She recognized names in the chat as those printed on envelopes that arrived monthly at her grandfather's house. She saw how they had turned him into a character in their private narrative, a symbol of everything they thought made the neighborhood look less desirable to future buyers. When Henry was stable enough to listen, she told him what she had found. He had always known, at some level, that he made certain neighbors uncomfortable simply by existing where they did not expect him. Hearing that discomfort spelled out in messages imposing he had spent decades working, paying taxes, paying dues, watching waves of people move in and out. Now, in the minds of those holding the HOA's megaphone, he had become an eyesore. Alicia was not interested in accepting this as an unfortunate fact. She understood how institutions worked, both in hospitals and beyond. She knew that polite complaints could be ignored indefinitely, while formal filings created obligations. She started with the city's office that handled discrimination and civil rights in housing and public services. The complaint she drafted did not sound like a social media post. It sounded like a case. It documented the dates and times of police visits as recorded in official logs. It noted that each visit had ended with confirmation of Henry's residency and no further action. It described his medical condition and the doctor's recommendation that he rest on his porch. It attached screenshots of HOA members discussing him as a problem and strategizing about using law enforcement to create a record. The city opened an investigation. That meant requesting records from the police department. It meant asking the HOA for its policies on contacting law enforcement. It meant calling the HOA president and board members for interviews, during which their words would be recorded and possibly compared to what they had written casually in their chat. The police department's logs showed a pattern that was hard to rationalize away. Multiple calls over months and years, all about the same address and person. The complaints were consistently vague. The outcomes were consistently uneventful. In internal reviews, supervisors often looked for clusters like this as signs of a problematic dress. Here, the problem turned out to be the callers, not the called. A civil rights lawyer agreed to take Henry's case after reading the city's preliminary findings. The lawyer had seen versions of this story before, in different suburbs and under different names. A private association, created to maintain lawns and collect dues, slowly inflated its sense of power. Residents with new money and older prejudices decided they knew what did and did not belong on their street. The lawyer knew that such cases were rarely tidy. They required patience, persistence, and careful assembly of evidence into a narrative that even people who had never heard of Willow Grove could understand. Legal action meant discovery. Discovery meant the HOA would have to hand over not just polished meeting minutes and public newsletters, but also the raw communications that had shaped their actions. The board resisted at first, arguing that the group chat was informal, that members had a right to private conversation. The court's response was simple. Private conversations become relevant when they are used to coordinate collective action against an individual. So the messages came out. In the lawyer's office, Alicia and Henry sat across from a large monitor, while the lawyer scrolled through months of exchanges. They saw early discussions of landscaping and party planning. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. There were photos of Henry on his porch, sometimes with captions about him always being there. There were suggestions that his presence at the entrance made the neighborhood look less safe or less upscale. There were explicit instructions from board officers telling others to call the police whenever they saw him outside, not because he was doing anything different, but because documentation would be useful. Later messages showed an attempt at self-correction once the board realized someone might be watching. They advised each other to keep it about rules, to avoid certain words, to refer to community standards instead of personal feelings. But the earlier content could not be erased. It sat in the export file with dates, timestamps, and names. Body camera footage from the officers' visits added another layer. The videos showed Henry pushing himself up from the chair with obvious effort, leaning on his cane, handing over his wallet with steady movements that nonetheless marked his age. They recorded the calm, rehearsed way he answered the same questions over and over. In the background of some clips, the edges of yoga pants and polo shirts appeared as board members lingered to see what would happen, their arms crossed, their faces arranged in disapproval as if that were another uniform. When the case finally reached a courtroom, it did not resemble the dramatic scenes from television dramas. There were no shouted confessions, no last-minute witnesses bursting through doors. There was a judge, a few rows of hard benches, binders full of documents and screens ready to show video. Henry sat beside Alicia at the plaintiff's table. His cane rested against his leg. His hands were folded on top of a legal pad he had no intention of writing on. Across the aisle, the HOA's attorney shuffled papers and avoided Henry's gaze. A representative from the police department sat stiffly in a suit, keenly aware that whatever happened, their logs and procedures would be examined. The lawyer laid out the story, the evidence told. Repeated calls about the same man sitting on his own property. An HOA chat encouraging those calls not out of immediate fear, but out of a desire to make the neighborhood look a certain way. A pattern in which the presence of an elderly black man was treated as a threat to property values, while his actual behavior never rose to the level of any statute on the books. The lawyer spoke about misuse of public resources, about harassment wrapped in procedural language, about the long American habit of using systems built for safety as tools for exclusion. The judge read the chat transcripts. They saw board members describe Henry as a constant presence we need to deal with, and not the image we want at the entrance. They saw notes about how many times the police had been called with no effect yet. They read the loitering clause in the bylaws and compared it to the reality of a man sitting on his own porch. The police logs and body cam footage, when placed side by side with the chat records, did something that no single anecdote could have. They showed in undeniable terms that the HOA had tried to build a case out of nothing more than their discomfort with a neighbor's existence. The officers had been drawn into that effort, perhaps without malice, but certainly without sufficient skepticism about why the same address kept appearing. The outcome was a settlement negotiated before the case could drag on for years. Money changed hands, enough to acknowledge harm, but not enough to undo decades of work and savings Henry had already poured into the house. More important to Alicia, and eventually to Henry, were the non-monetary terms. The HOA agreed to change its policies around contacting law enforcement. Board members could no longer instruct residents to call the police on a particular individual simply to generate a record. Any request to involve officers had to be tied to specific, observable behavior that violated a law, not just a bylaw. The association also agreed to undergo training on discrimination and bias, not as a vague gesture, but as a structured requirement delivered by an outside organization. The police department implemented its own changes. Their system began flagging addresses that appeared frequently in calls without resulting in reports or charges. Supervisors were required to review those patterns and, when necessary, contact the residents involved to understand whether they were being harassed through the complaint process. Officers received reminders in briefings about the difference between investigating a report and validating a caller's prejudice. A written statement became part of the settlement file. In it, the HOA acknowledged that its actions had caused undue distress and contributed to a hostile environment for a resident in good standing. The phrasing was legal and careful, but the meaning was clear enough. On paper, in a place where future boards and future lawyers could find it, there was now a record of what had been done. Henry did not suddenly feel lighter because a judge had signed a document. The stress of the process had left its mark. His heart still skipped occasionally in ways that made Alicia watch him more closely. His body still protested when he stood up from the chair. But something in the relationship between him and his porch shifted. In the months after the case ended, he noticed small changes. Patrol cars drove past the subdivision more slowly, not because they were hunting for problems, but because the department had told officers to be more deliberate about how they responded to calls from HOA-heavy neighborhoods. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a quick hello started stopping to ask about the weather or about the tree in his yard. A few older residents quietly admitted that they had not known the extent of what the board had been doing in their name. The group chat continued to exist, but its tone changed. Its members had learned that what felt like private commentary could someday be projected on a courtroom screen. Jokes about the man at the entrance disappeared. Messages about enforcement became more cautious and specific. That did not mean that every bias evaporated. It did mean that acting on those biases through the machinery of rules and police became more complicated. Henry's porch remained what it had always been to him, a small piece of concrete and wood separating inside from outside, private from public. The difference now was that his right to occupy that space no longer relied on the goodwill of people who valued property values more than people. It rested on something firmer, documented in records that would outlast individual tempers and terms of office. On a late afternoon, not long after his next birthday, he sat in his folding chair, cane within reach, water bottle on the side table, pill for the evening already taken. Alicia sat beside him, legs stretched out, scrolling slowly through her phone, not in search of evidence this time, but simply out of habit. Cars moved past the entrance. A delivery driver consulted a map. A group of children biked in careful circles, the way children always had. At the stone sign that announced Willow Grove Estates, the painted letters caught the light. No one passing by would guess that a fight over who was allowed to sit and watch the world from a particular porch had once turned that quiet street into a case file. Henry watched it all with the measured gaze of someone who had seen neighborhoods and rules and faces change, while the basic questions remained stubbornly similar. Who belongs? Who decides? And what happens when the story someone tells about you finally has to match the facts? The answer, on that day at least, was simple. He belonged on his porch. He intended to stay there. And if anyone somewhere in a board meeting or a group chat forgot that, there were now papers and policies, and a granddaughter who knew exactly how to remind them.